Hey everyone, and welcome to the Gray Sheets Device Week podcast. I'm editor David Fillmore. I'm joined by reporters Danny Al-Farouk and Sue Darcy, senior editor Reed Miller, and our editor-at-large Sean Schmidt. We're going to talk about issues we're covering important to the device and diagnostics community. Today, we'll touch on combination product reforms, unique device identifier updates, device money on the Hill, some defibrillator data, and we'll talk about our interview with CDRH's current compliance chief. First, let's start with you, Danny. It seems like reforms to how combination products such as drug-device combinations are, how they're reviewed by FDA are looking likely in the next few years, according to what I saw that you wrote this week. Tell me about that.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So, we went to this DIA annual meeting recently, and at that meeting, both FDA's Jeff Shuren and Robert Califf talked about reforming the combination product review process, and we did an interview, if you remember, recently with Califf, but at the meeting they also added some more details. So they've especially been tackling this problem as the number of consultations from CDRH from CDER to CDRH has skyrocketed over the past couple of years. So they talked about some of the challenges they're facing and solutions they're looking at. But maybe the most interesting thing that I found was that they signaled they'll be prioritizing combination product review issues during the upcoming user fee negotiations in July.
Right, so that user fee negotiations, sort of a kickoff meeting in July, and probably negotiations will start through 2016. It sounds like, so combination products it'll be interesting to see if they get discussed there. It sounds like part of the issue was kind of a mismatch between drug and device regulations and that causing complications, but also just more sort of basic communication issues at FDA. Is that right?
Yeah. Califf kind of said, we need to have a new culture at FDA because they were saying, everybody is working within their own little world and working on issues that are specific to either the drug or device industry. And so what he was saying is there needs to be better communications. And he was saying even something as simple as setting up the right meetings between the right people when it comes to combination products could go a long way.
Interesting. We'll have to see how that goes. Definitely something to watch to make user fee discussions more interesting, to know that something like big changes on combo products might be in the front. So the second thing you wrote about recently was touching on the unique device identifier program, Danny. So UDIs already must appear on labels of the highest risk devices, I think as of last fall. But recently FDA released a draft guidance on the requirements for some devices to have the UDI marked directly on the device. Is that right?
Yeah. So this guidance we just wrote about it basically proposes that when FDA requires direct marketing of UDIs and medical products, what are the methods and technologies that the agency thinks is appropriate, while the agency doesn't actually say which ones they want labelers to use. And they also talk about what UDI information needs to be logged into the FDA's global unique device identification database. But I think the most important thing that they laid out here is they propose a timeline when different devices based on their classification need to be adopted and what those requirements are. And in fact, the reprocess and reuse life-sustaining and life-supporting devices that we've reported on in the past, regardless of their classification, will have to follow these requirements as early as this September.
Okay, and so this direct marking is really specifically for reprocess reused devices, as opposed to, say, the ones that are used just once or implantables. Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So and in the guidance, they also explain what they mean by the reprocess and how specific they are about that issue.
Great, thanks. So before I let you go, Danny, I think you also wanted to mention you did an interesting podcast interview this week. Who was that with?
Well, actually, I had the podcast a couple of weeks ago with bioMérieux's CEO, Stefan Willemsen, and bioMérieux recently spoke at the White House antibiotic stewardship meeting, and it was really interesting. He basically talked about what does the industry need to do in order to develop diagnostic tools to stop the spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and he also gave some tips to companies that might be considering what they want to, who are considering signing up for the $20 million NIH and BARDA competition to develop new rapid point-of-care diagnostics for antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Thanks, Danny. Let's switch over to Sue now. Sue, you focused on federal funding issues related to FDA this week out of Congress. What were you looking at?
Well, I was looking at some appropriations bills. The House Appropriations Committee released a draft funding bill for the Ag Department and FDA that would support the Device Center in 2016 at a slightly lower level of $319 million than the current funding level, and House appropriators totally neglected to add any more funding to carry out FDA's $10 million allotted portion of President Obama's Precision Medicine Initiative. This sets the stage for a budget fight in Congress over the funding that will be needed next year to help regulate molecular diagnostics used in precision medicine.
Okay, but that money doesn't include user fees, right? I think there's $130 million plus expected in industry user fees in 2016. Is that right?
Well, that's true, but Congressional Budget Authority still accounts for the lion's share of the device budget. Similarly, backers of the House Energy and Commerce Committee-approved Cures bill also face an uphill battle with House appropriators. They have not set aside any additional dollars to begin implementing Cures in 2016, provided that similar Senate provisions of the bill are approved by the year's end. The Cures measure, aimed at promoting device innovation and easing regulatory burdens for manufacturers, has 230 co-sponsors in the House, so that should easily win House passage. The Senate is moving more slowly, but seems to be going down the same path with its own bills, but there's still no appropriated dollars in sight to help fund these provisions.
So how much does the 21st Century Cures bill as it now stands cost? I think the Congressional Budget Office put a price tag on it this past week. Is that right?
That's right. CBO this week released an economic analysis showing that the Cures bill would eventually reduce spending in Medicare by $11.9 billion. But however, it also shows that implementing the legislation would cost $106.4 million in dollars that Congress will have to appropriate starting in 2016. And to carry out just the device-related portions of that bill would cost $299 million over 10 years, including $158 million in spending just for the breakthrough devices provision.
Right, that breakthrough provision has definitely probably gotten the most attention of any of the device provisions in the bill, kind of accelerated program for devices that address unmet needs. And some FDA officials have sort of signaled that concerns about the extra burden it's going to put on the agency without any extra money from Congress. So that'll be something to watch. Why don't we switch directions and go to Reed next? Reed, you were writing about some interesting data for implantable cardioverter defibrillators, I think. Could you tell me about that?
Yeah, so there was a trial led by some people at Duke that was looking at the actual sort of real-world rate of patients getting an ICD after they had a heart attack and had a low left ventricular ejection fraction. As you may remember, a little over 10 years ago, there were a couple major studies that established that putting ICDs in this patient population will save lives because they are at higher risk for sudden cardiac death, even though they had never had an arrhythmia before. However, what this study found is that looking especially at the older patient population, only about 8% of these patients are actually getting an ICD, even though the study also found that there was a mortality benefit associated with the ICD. So I talked to the author, and he kind of talked about the implications and maybe suggested some things that the clinical community and the industry can do to kind of promote this. It's been over the last 10 years, it's been an important issue, and it's something that the companies, at least a while ago, were putting a lot of emphasis on, but it's not something they've really talked about lately. So hopefully this trial will sort of bring it back into the fore about how they can get ICDs into more patients that would benefit from them.
Any particular strategies?
Well, he talked about it's just really important that the patients are kind of aware of what their options are. And at the time, they have the heart attack, and then they'll be in the hospital, and then maybe they'll get an ICD, or maybe they won't. But at that time, that they really are aware of what their options are, and that they engage with their doctor and talk to the cardiologist about it. Because one of the things that they identified as possibly being the problem is there's a 40-day window established in the guidelines that says you shouldn't get your ICD within the first 40 days after you have your heart attack, because there's some data that suggests that that's not actually helpful to do it within the first 40 days, and that you're supposed to do it after those 40 days. But a lot of patients are kind of getting lost in the shuffle during that 40-day period, because they're out of the hospital, but they're sort of waiting around for whatever happens next, and they just they never talk to the right people about their risk of sudden cardiac death. So that's something he thinks really needs to be looked at. Not that they would want to take away the 40-day period necessarily, if in fact that is an important part of why the therapy works or doesn't work, but just to make sure that both the physicians and the patients are kind of aware of what the situation is and kind of aware what their options are and what they should be talking about.
Great. Thanks, Reed. Interesting study. Sean, why don't we switch over to you? You recently spoke to Jan Welch, who's heading up the compliance office in the FDA Device Center right now. That's a nice exclusive interview for us. So what did you guys discuss?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I did have an in-depth Q&A conversation with CDRH's interim compliance chief, Jan Welch. And she did talk about the future of particular device center programs and initiatives, including their case for quality. But Welch says that even though a permanent compliance office director will be named this fall, she's still gung-ho about the case for quality, pointing out that it's, quote, huge, important, and bigger than any one person. Welch also says case for quality has momentum. She points out FDA's experimentation with a critical to quality inspection approach and the creation of a new FDA Library of Quality Practice, among other initiatives that are being worked on. But Welch also opened up about communication with device manufacturers. She warns that if firms don't speak up, then some issues of importance to them could end up on the agency's back burner. And is Jan Welch interested in the compliance director job full-time? Well, you'll have to check out this feature online on Monday to see what she says.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Curious, since I know she's still just the interim chief and sounds like she has a lot of ideas. So I'd be interested to see how that goes forward. What else are you working on? Anything else in the near term?
I sure am, Dave. There's a new Compliance Corner feature that'll be released online next week that will highlight tips and advice from national device expert Phil Ponticos and several other FDA investigators.
Thanks. Great, Sean. Appreciate it. There are more details on all the topics we spoke about today and a lot more at our website, thegraysheet.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at Graysheet. One program note, we'll not be doing the podcast next week due to the July 4th holiday. Look for the next episode of Device Week on July 13th. For now, thanks for listening.